document in the New Testament we're going to start today called Hebrews that for the vast majority of church history was thought to be Pauline. So it's anonymous. It doesn't say, I, Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother, to XYZ, to Philemon, or whatever. It just begins. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors, and it doesn't sign off. I, Paul, wrote this to you, grace and peace. So, it's anonymous. A lot of the early church did think it was Paul for various reasons. Some of them stylistic, some of them because he mentions Timothy at the end, and so for various reasons, it was ascribed to Paul. I can't remember exactly when in sort of church or academic history it stopped being taken for granted that it was Pauline. Certainly, it's the largest consensus in academic scholarship right now is that this isn't Pauline. That it's not. But it's like all these things kind of actually going to come back. There are people who've now kind of made the first positive argument for it since, for the last couple hundred years. So now people are thinking about it. Could be, might not be, I don't know. I don't think we're ever going to know until we get another document that we can prove was also from Paul, and he's like, and I wrote a letter to the Hebrews that says XYZ. That's like, I feel like the only way we can verify this. Because, it's a lot of things. This is one of my favorite texts in the New Testament for a lot of reasons. One is it has one of the only extended reflections on what Christ is doing now. You get that as an aside in a handful of passages. So you get, Paul will say in Romans 8:34 that who died, but yes, more was raised, is seated at the right hand of power, and is interceding for us. That's, and you get him in 1 Corinthians 15 saying, he must reign until he's put all his enemies under his feet, So you get, okay, he's reigning now in the heavenly space, and he's interceding. There are two sentences, from Paul about sort of a description of what Christ is doing now. Hebrews has an extended reflection of it, both visualizing, in other words, like depicting it, like trying to paint a picture for you, like actually depicting what Christ is doing, and just talking about what Christ is doing. It's also, in its own way, a lot of it is like beautifully simple, like a lot of the New Testament is, and a lot of it is maybe complex isn't the right word, sophisticated. It's making a sophisticated argument that depends upon detailed knowledge of Torah and the tabernacle and the sacrificial system and other things. He's not explaining all that stuff. He's assuming knowledge of it and then building up. That's one of the things that makes Hebrews so interesting and sophisticated, is because he's assuming that his audience already shares a lot of information, and that he doesn't have to explain the sacrificial system to them. He assumes that they already understand that and is explaining something on top of it and using analogy to describe it. So because so much of his exposition, and it's probably a male author, some people have thought it was a female, but he used a participle referring to his own activity, and it's a masculine participle, so I don't think a female would do that. The author uses, what was I just saying? He creates analogies based on, a lot of his reasoning is analogical. In the same way that we know that this is happening, so in the same way, Christ is doing this. So a lot of his argument is analogical. It also, again, depends upon, why, like his argument depends upon assumptions that are shared between him and his audience that oftentimes are not things that we just understand intuitively. Like he's got I'm trying to avoid the word complex. He's got a nuanced, sophisticated cosmology. In other words, a view of the physical nature of the world. He thinks that there is sort of heavenly space, that there is earthly space, and that heavenly space is physical, and that earthly space is also physical, but the heavenly space that's physical is sort of like unshakable, immortal, and that physical stuff down here is mortal and shakeable, right? Able to be shaken. So there, that seems like okay, that's not a big deal. But actually, it is because he's not distinguishing between sort of non-physical things up in heaven over against physical things down here. He's distinguishing between physical things that endure and physical things that don't. And that is tied up both with the stuff that they're made up of, their material composition, and also their location. Earthly stuff is material, but weak and perishable. Heavenly stuff is also material and physical, but not weak and will not perish. Right? And that's a difference than a lot of modern cosmologies that kind of assume heavenly space is sort of wispy and ethereal, over against sort of down here it's physical. And that he's not saying that, he's like, nope, it's material and physical up there too. In fact, he's reversing the logic. It's probably more so. It's more physical. It's more durable, not less, right? So Lewis has this great line about Christ's resurrection, where in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus sort of appears through a wall that had been locked, And so, he says that, it's our tendency to kind of assume that Christ must have been sort of ghosty, right? Because that's how you think of it. If he can walk through a wall, he must be ghosty, right? Except Lewis, just like he always says, he reverses the logic, says, no, it's actually the reverse. He's more substantial than the wall. It's not that he's ghosty relative to the wall and so can walk through it. It's that he's more substantial than the wall or the door, and so can walk through it. In the same way that you might imagine like your dorm room that might have like beaded doors, right? You can walk through those. Why? Not because it's not physical. It's material, physical. But why can you walk through it? You're more substantial to the wall, not it to you, right? So it doesn't depend upon ghosts physical. It depends upon higher degree of substantiality, being able to pass through a lower degree of substantiality. So this is how the author of Hebrews is depicting heavenly space and earthly space, and consequently that will make a difference as to how he's depicting Christ. Because Christ is operative in this space. He's going to talk about Christ as operative in heavenly space, interceding as our high priest. But, again, this is where it sounds weird to us, because we assume if he's up there, well, he's got to just, I don't know what he's doing up there, right? He's up in heaven, what's he doing? And the author of Hebrews is saying he's up there with flesh and blood. He actually took his own flesh and blood up into that space. And so his argument depends upon him being operative in physical, unshakable, immortal space, but that physical immortality is not something other than the flesh and blood that you and I have now. So that it's not a distinction between, the flesh and blood's down here, and spirity stuff's up there. There's flesh and blood bodies down here that die, over against flesh and blood bodies that don't. Christ has a flesh and blood body that doesn't die. Right? Again, if that sounds esoteric, what are we talking about? This is the stuff of Hebrews argument. Like, this is the stuff that he'll build his premises on. So you just kind of have to.
Sounds just like Greek mythology.
Yeah, well, interestingly, Greek mythology depends upon. Sometimes the Greek mythologies though can have different cosmologies in which, like for example, Plato, Platonic cosmologies will go from physical up to non-physical, and Hebrews can often sound kind of Platonic, except he doesn't go from physical to non-physical. He goes from physical to also physical but immortal. Slightly different. Okay, so we're gonna do a couple more things that are sort of stage setting, and then we're going to jump into the text. So you have to know a few themes. One of the things that I think one of my a teacher that I've learned a lot from is a guy named David Moffat. One thing that he's shown, I think that is worth thinking about, is that this community has believed the gospel and has believed certain things about Christ, but that at this point they're starting to have questions or raise doubts about some of them, and that there are certain points in the letter where sort of maybe the things that they're doubting or questioning become a bit more obvious. And so if you look at, for example, look at 4:14. Since then we have 4:14. Since then we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. He's exhorting them to hold fast to their confession. And one of the things that they confess is that Jesus is our high priest. Right? So one of the objects or content of their confession is that Christ is our high priest. And so he's saying, since then we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus, Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we don't have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. But we have one who in every respect is as tested as we are, and yet is without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness. Every high priest has, and he goes on in 5:1. Skip down to 5:11. He distinguishes between the high priesthood of Melchizedek over against others, and he says, and about this we have much to say that it's hard to explain, since you have become dull in understanding. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, instead you need someone to teach you again the basic elements of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is unskilled, but solid food is for the mature, those whose faculties have been trained. Therefore, let us go on, leaving behind the basic teaching about Christ, and not laying on again the foundation of XYZ. And then he gives them exhortations. And then again, if you look down, look at chapter 7, you'll notice he starts talking about Melchizedek a lot. Melchizedek over against the Levitical priesthood. And then now, and that discourse goes from chapter 7 through 10. And at the end of his long discourse, he then says, and look at 10:19, therefore, my friends, since we have confidence to enter the sanctuary by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he's opened for us, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us approach with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. And he goes on. Now, my point is that in multiple times, twice he exhorts them to hold on to the confession, and twice he talks about how one of the objects of their confession is Christ's own high priesthood. And the extended discourse at the very middle, the heart of this letter is chapter 7 through 10, in which he's giving his sort of sophisticated argument, and it's an argument about the legitimacy of Christ's high priesthood. In other words, it sounds like that the community was founded on a confession. They believe the gospel, they believe basic things. They believe that Christ is our great high priest who's operative in the heavenly space, and that he's doing all this. He's won salvation for us and will continue to win for us, all these great things. But that some within the community have begun to doubt that aspect of the confession. And they've raised, again, this is where it's a nuanced, sophisticated argument, they've raised legitimate questions that chapters 7 through 10 it looks as if chapter 7 through 10 are designed to respond to the legitimate questions they've raised about Christ's high priesthood. Now again, I mentioned earlier, the text depends upon a nuanced understanding of Torah and law and tabernacle stuff. If you were a community of probably either Jews or Gentiles who grew up in sort of Jewish culture and have been acculturated into Jewish ways, if you've had this confession about Christ's high priesthood and that he's our sacrifice, all these things, what would be some legitimate questions you might have? Like even if you're a believer in that, and then you sort of, now it's 5 years along, maybe you've come onto this, you keep going to synagogue or whatever, and a fellow non-believing Jew asks you some questions, and all of a sudden, like, you go back home, you're like, that was a really good question. I think that was a good point. I don't know. So what are some objections that someone could raise to the content of that confession?
Is high priesthood equal with Messiah? Is it the same thing?
No, not necessarily. But an anointed person can be anointed as a priest, so there could be, yeah.
Jesus is from the tribe of Judah.
Yeah,
Levi.
tribes, priests have to be Levites. They have to be, by law. They have to be Levites. But he's not a Levite, he's a Judite. And so if you're saying Christ is our high priest, and then you say that this is all in fulfillment of law, and then someone else will be like, well, good, the law says you gotta be a Levite, he's not a Levite. That's a legitimate, all of a sudden it's a legitimate question that either someone in the community might have or someone outside the community might have raised. Right. What else? That was a big one.
Is that if you believe that, then you're saying Jesus supplants God's authority somehow?
Okay, yeah. I mean, some people might be raising questions about that. I don't think that wouldn't necessarily follow, because you would just say that God has ordained him to be the high priest or something. Right? Human sacrifice is not permissible according to the law. Like, you cannot offer human sacrifice in the tabernacle. And all of a sudden, you're saying that Christ both is our high priest and gave himself as a sacrifice. You think like, what? Like, he's not a Levite, so he can't be a high priest, and he can't offer himself. You can't give human sacrifice is prohibited in Torah if it's a tabernacle.
On top of that, he asks us to eat his flesh.
Yeah, also complicated. Yeah, and so in other words, these are legitimate questions that it appears chapters 7 through 10 are designed to respond to. And so the confession has included confessions about Christ as our high priest, etc., and his offering, and then some within the community who are the law have said, well, wait, okay, if the law remains valid at some level, then, like, he's not a legitimate high priest. He can't be a high priest. He's not a Levite. And also, what he offered is illegitimate. And so the author is giving part of his argument, chapter 7 is an extended argument to argue for A, the legitimacy of his high priesthood, because he's from the order of Melchizedek, not Levi. And because of the fact that his offering takes place in heaven, not in earth, and heavenly space has different cultic regulations. So he has to argue for the validity of both.
Melchizedek, explaining how Melchizedek was chosen.
We'll get there. This is more just sort of stage setting. We'll spend a lot of time on Melchizedek once we get to Hebrews 7. Yeah, it's sort of just stage setting to show like this is what's at stake in the left. Right. Okay. The other final thing to understand before we jump in is we've done this a lot, so sorry, but I have to do it. There's a lot of new things, and also probably can't hear enough. This is the, I should probably just keep this up there. This is the layout of the Jerusalem tabernacle. Yes, tabernacle. The tabernacle, the earthly tabernacle. Say what? Okay. Tabernacle is just the word is just tent. Just means tent. It's sacred because God's presence is here. So God has made the space holy because God is intrinsically holy. So wherever He is becomes holy by proximity or contact. Right? So He is present here, or His glory is present here. This is the Ark of the Covenant. Ark. This is the altar for incense. Well, this is really not to scale, but this is the altar of incense, and this is the altar for burnt offerings. In order to approach sacred space, you have to be in a state of ritual purity. So you have to be in a state of ritual purity to approach sacred space. Being ritually impure is not immoral. It just, you have to fix the problem before you approach sacred space. So the sources of ritual impurity are corpses, lepra, menstrual and postpartum blood,
seminal flux, and certain animal carcasses. So if you come into contact with any of these sources of ritual impurity, you're now in a state of ritual impurity. It's not transgressive. You don't have to ask for forgiveness. You don't have to do anything. But if you've contacted a source of ritual impurity, excuse me, you're now in a state of ritual impurity, and you have to purify before you approach sacred space. To purify is quite simple in most cases. All you do is walk into an immersion pit, like a water pit. You walk into a water pit and then come out. By sundown of the same day, you're clean. That's it. The only times that it's a bit more complex is if you are recovering. Lepra is the word for, we often translate it leprosy. It's not leprosy. We don't know quite what it is, but we know it's not leprosy because it is something that can, like your walls of your house can contract it, your bag can contract it, your garments can contract it. Also, when your skin contracts it, it doesn't, none of the symptoms that the Bible describes correspond to what we now think of as leprosy. So it's, I'm sorry? If it were on your house walls, yeah. But like your house can get it, your walls, your bags can get it. When a human gets it, it's some sort of superficial, the common denominator is it's a superficial irritation of X, right? So skin, a leather bag, or your wall, right? And so it's a superficial irritation of something, right? So if you have recovered from, if you had a case of lepra and you've recovered, or if you gave birth, and you've had, postpartum, then you do have to purify, and the purification procedure for that is a bit more complex, but it's still not for forgiveness or anything, it's just for purification. But the lepra recovery, or purification from lepra and postpartum discharge require sacrifice, but not for forgiveness or anything. So all this is to say is that if you contact with any of these sources, you're now in a state of ritual impurity and you can't approach sacred space. So in order to approach sacred space, you need to be in a state of ritual purity. So purify before you go to the temple or the tabernacle. So that's point one. Point two is sacrifices. This is important. Sacrifices are not, if you've ever read like Narnia, this is a spoiler alert. Sorry if you haven't read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But the Aslan, how does Aslan die? Stone table, what happens to him? Yeah, the dagger. They lug this beast onto the stone table and then plunge it on the right. If you've got that image in your head and you think that's what sacrifice is, you're going to just not understand Jewish sacrifice, because that's not what sacrifice is. I mean that in two different ways. One of them is that that's not the mechanical procedure of sacrifice. That's really actually mostly what I mean. And two is that the sacrifice is never reducible to the killing of the animal. So sacrifice at its most basic feature just means to make something sacred. And it means that all of this over here is common space. So this is all common space. If it's not the tabernacle, you're in common space. That's it. The tabernacle is sacred or holy space. Those are the same word in Greek and Hebrew. Sacred, holy, same adjective. Hagios or kadosh. So if you want to transfer something from this space to that space, you you give it to it. You dedicate the thing, the object, to that space. And now it's holy. And you've thereby sacrificed it. And you can hear the word in it. It's made up of two words. Sacred and facere in Latin, to make. So to make something sacred. Well, how do you make something sacred? You just put it in the sacred domain. So you don't sacrifice something by killing it. You sacrifice it by giving it to God. Now, in a lot of cases, that will require killing the thing, whatever it is, right? That's how you transfer it to sacred space. My point is simply to say that sacrifice is not coterminous with killing. Slaughter does not equal sacrifice. Sacrifice does not equal slaughter. Sacrifice equals giving something to sacred space. One of the steps of sacrificing is slaughtering. But it's one step. Actually, if you read Leviticus 1, it's one of 9 steps. And it's the only one that can be done by a non-priest, which indicates probably its low-level significance, right? Priests are the ones who do this sacrificial activity. And so if the non-priest is permitted to kill the animal, it probably indicates not its lack of importance, but its low-tiered importance, right? In other words, if you kill the animal but then don't do anything else with it, per the procedure, you haven't offered a sacrifice. All you've done is kill an animal, right? So that's what sacrifice is. It means in Latin, it means to make something sacred, like to put it in a sacred space, right? In Hebrew, the Hebrew word is karav, and it quite literally means to approach. The Hebrew word for sacrifice is korban, and it's made up from the consonants for the verb to come near, to approach. So in other words, you've caused something to be near to God. That's all it means. Pause there for questions before I tell you why that's relevant. Well, let me do one, and then I'll show you. So you commit a certain kind of offense, and you bring the animal to the gateway, and then you put your hand, a single hand lean on the animal to indicate ownership, probably indicating that, okay, the benefit of this sacrifice will redound to me. And then the person who brings it slaughters it, so throat nick. And then the priest procures the animal's blood. And then, now the priest has a cup and basin, utensils full of animal blood, and then carries the blood, that is, into the sacred space, to the altar, and sprinkles it on the altar, and then pours out any remnant blood around the basin. Then, parts of the animal are, it depends on what kind of offering it is, but parts of the animal are then quartered and put on the altar and burned. If it's an offering for sin, so if I committed a sin and now I need to get forgiveness for that, I bring the animal, I'll do all the stuff I just said, and then portions of it are burned and portions of the meat are kept and the priest can eat it because the priests don't have food. Yeah, so this is how they procure their own meat. If it was the priest's own sin, so like if the priest committed sin and then has to bring a sin offering, then of course the priest can't then eat from that sin offering because then he'd be benefiting from his own sin, right?
Do the animals have to have purification the same way?
They have to have, no, they have to be unblemished. So they can't have blemishes. So like if they had like, a missing eye or like a broken leg or something. The blemishes are listed in Leviticus, the end of Leviticus 21 or 20. All the things that count as a blemish. But no, animals they don't have to be ritually purified. They don't have to like be immersed or anything, right? So yeah, that's it. You slaughter the animal, procure its blood, and then the priest takes its blood into the sacred space and then quarters the animal, does stuff to it, burns it, and the vast majority of the animal is then taken out and burned elsewhere. The vast majority of the animal is not put on the altar. That's why I say if you have the picture of plunging a knife into Aslan on an altar, you will just have the wrong image about sacrifice because this altar is 7 feet tall and is constantly on fire. Imagine trying to walk a bull up a 7-foot altar that's a furnace and then trying to get the bull to lay down onto that and then trying to plunge a knife into it while it's calmly doing that. It's just physically impossible. You're not going to do it. So they kill it right here, and then the priest walks up there himself with the blood, sprinkles it there, goes back down, butchers the animal in a certain way, then takes the meat back up and by putting it on the altar, it's turned into smoke. The smoke rises, and that's sort of its transfer into God's presence. So this spatial notion of God's presence. Now, the reason that's going to be significant for Hebrews is because the author of Hebrews is thinking this way when he's describing Christ's sacrifice. The author of Hebrews will describe Christ's ascent into heaven, as if that were the analogy with the priest carrying the blood into the sacred space. So in the same way that an offering gets carried into the presence of God, so in the same way, Christ going into the presence of God, i.e. into heaven, is how how the author of Hebrews will describe Christ's sacrifice. So in other words, again, this is the part where it will sound different, it won't sound the same way they're used to hearing it, but it's just the way Hebrews talks. I mean, he just says, he's very quite explicit about it. The author of Hebrews describes Christ's sacrifice as taking place in heaven.
The sacred, making things sacred, how does that relate to Jesus? Because he's already God.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really good question. Well, because he's got a human body that is subject to imperfection. And so the author's a really good question, because the author of Hebrews talks about him as being sinless and yet as having been perfected. You think, how can he have been perfected? He says he learned and was perfected by what he suffered. How could he have been perfected if he's sinless? Because he talks about him as sinless too. He says he committed no sin, etc. So he describes him as morally sinless and yet as having been perfected. So then what got perfected?
Would the order of Melchizedek, would they still have to go through the ritual purifications?
Interestingly, no, because again, this will get to it. The author of Hebrews will
He did a lot of things that made him ritually impure on our behalf.
yeah.
For instance, the lady that was hemorrhaging.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But then, according to the author of Hebrews, he was resurrected, and he was resurrected into an immortal body. An immortal body that's physical, so it's a physical body, but it's an immortal, unperishable one. So even it says, by virtue of his indestructible life, he became our priest. And so he says that with this indestructible life, with this indestructible body, he entered into sacred space. Because an indestructible body is no longer subject to any of these sources of ritual impurity. In other words, sources of ritual impurity are all things related to death and decay.
So that's how he was
Perfected, like quite literally perfected bodily. He was perfected in his resurrection body. So now has a resurrected, he's a perfected existence in a human body, and with that, as that, entered into the sacred space, and there offered himself. So again, the author of Hebrews talks about him offering himself, literally, like just going into God's presence as the offering.
And that's what we can look forward to.
Precisely, yeah. That's why he says he went on as our forerunner, because he's saying that's what y'all will do. So if it's a forerunner, he's doing it before you, right? So that's what the author of Hebrews has in mind, the notion of receiving a perfected body so that you can enter into sacred space, right? Because again, the logic is, right, if you're in a state of ritual impurity, you can't approach. But ritual impurity are all signs of decay, the signs of decay and mortality, right? And so, well, what if you have that assumption, that ritual impurity is the sign of decay and mortality, etc., and yet you also had the goal or the wish or the desire just to be in God's presence, well, then what would you have to do? You'd have to ritually purify before you go into God's presence. But then, I mean, just think about it literally mechanistically. You're a human. You're going to become impure again. You're going to get weak. You're going to get hungry. You're going to have to just leave the tent to go out here and sleep and eat and whatever else. And then eventually you're going to become impure again. So then you got to purify before you can go back in, right? But what if you're an author like the author of Hebrews who thinks like, no, but the goal is to be in God's presence always and to never leave it. Then what would you have to have? You'd have to have a body no longer subject to ritual impurity. But interestingly, that's thinking with the categories of ritual impurity, not against them. In other words, he's assuming that, yeah, our physical bodies are the kinds of bodies that are subject to decay and thus to ritual impurity. But if I want to have the kind of body that can always be in God's presence, I need the kind of body that's no longer subject to decay, ritual impurity, which author of Hebrews says Christ has now, a resurrected body that is imperishable, and therefore, again, it's not just an interesting argument, it's like soteria, it's like relevant for salvation, because he says that Christ has this resurrected body, and because he's got the kind of body that will never die again, he always lives to make intercession. In other words, he makes a contrast between what Christ can do in heaven over against what the Levitical priest could do down here. And it wasn't sort of like the Levitical priests were just, dummies. It was like, no, they were doing as good a job as they could, but they're mortal. And that means that there had to be a lot of them because they all kept dying. And they can only enter there once per year, and then they have to leave. Like the high priest can only enter into the sacred space to intercede for the people once per year for about 90 seconds. This is what the author of Hebrews says in chapter 7, 8, and 9. Because that's different than Christ, who's able to enter into the sacred space in heaven and never has to leave. So this is his, now quoting, because he's received this imperishable life, he always lives to make intercession. And he says, therefore, we can always draw near to God through him. And he saves completely those who draw near to God through him. In other words, he builds a security of salvation argument based on the resurrection of Christ. The resurrection of Christ ensures that he can always be in the presence of God interceding. Therefore, he can save securely all those who draw near to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Okay, cool questions through there?
I don't know if that's really good news for a milk drinker like me.
A milk
Does
drink.
your analogy include that we had to kill Christ outside of the space?
Yeah, it's interesting because the one time,
His body was the thing that is
it's really interesting. Look at I know it's time. We'll go down and then we'll start Hebrews next time. Or this was all. I would have had to do this stage setting no matter what. So, look at, and then we'll close. Look at look at 13, 11, and 12. Look at 13, 11, and 12. It says, for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest as a sacrifice for sins are burned outside the camp. Remember what I said earlier? Most of the animal is not put on the altar. Most of the animal is burned outside the camp. Okay, you're with me? It means it's not an offering. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. Therefore, notice again, he makes a logical connection. Therefore, Jesus also suffered outside the city gate. But the analogy he draws, when he coordinates Christ's suffering to the sacrificial process, what does he coordinate it with? According to Hebrews 13, 11, and 12. Well, no, he says, no, so again, for the bodies of those animals whose blood, for the bodies of the animals whose blood was taken in, the bodies of those animals is burned outside the camp. Therefore, Jesus also suffered outside the city gate. In other words, when the author of Hebrews is thinking about Christ's death, what part of the sacrificial procedure does he coordinate it with? No. The burning outside the camp, which is a non-sacrificial, it's part of the sacrificial procedure, but it's a disposal rite. In other words, the one time that the author of Hebrews actually coordinates Christ's death with sacrifice, it's not with the animal's slaughter. It's with his burning outside the camp. Which I don't actually know what all to make of it. My point is simply that a lot of people just assume that, oh, okay, well, of course, if he's going to think like a sacrifice, he's going to coordinate it with his animal's slaughter. But he doesn't. The one time he talks about his death in sacrificial terms, he coordinates his death not with the slaughter, but with a different element of the procedure, his burning outside the camp.
Burning is the incense that goes up.
I think he's just saying that he's trying to create an analogy between Christ's suffering and ours, but he knows that he doesn't want to coordinate it too closely with what goes on in the tabernacle, because for the author of Hebrews, the sacrifice doesn't refer to Christ's death, but to his offering in heaven. And so he has to be able to, he wants to be able to distinguish what Christ is doing up there in the heaven, qua sacrifice, over against what he suffered down here. And he's got to be able to distinguish those.
So what I keep seeing this image of the smoke rising and Jesus' spirit rising.
Yeah. Well, no, yeah, the author of Hebrews won't coordinate it that way because he wants him to be up there bodily. So he says he goes up there bodily, and that is what he offers himself as a sacrifice with this resurrected body. That's what the author of Hebrews coordinates it with. I mean, he doesn't say it is that. He says he gives an exhortation to say, therefore, let's do it this way too, right? My point is to say the author of Hebrews describes Christ's presence in heaven as his sacrifice. Because it's the offering of, quite literally, physically, the offering of, he's making himself present to God, right? In other words, because remember, a sacrifice is transferring something to sacred space. So that's what the author of Hebrews, he did. He transferred himself up in sacred space and there just gave himself as the sacrifice to God. So he's locating his sacrificial offering in heavenly space there. After his resurrection, yeah. After his resurrection, he goes up into heaven with his resurrected body, and his resurrected body is the offering that he gives to God. Now, that's all stuff that I've just so far asserted and haven't shown you. If you do want to just go see it, read Hebrews 7 through 10. And now that you kind of have that in mind, Hebrews 7 through 10 just says it actually pretty plainly. It'll kind of pop up the page for you. He even says that he's not a priest. If he were on earth, he couldn't be a priest. Which again, that assumes that he couldn't make an offering on earth, right?
So to move forward, part of the Holy Trinity is actually human in nature.
Human nature, yeah. The Son is human and divine, yeah. Yeah, the calcid, yep. Okay, sorry, we have to stop for time. It's like 5 till. And again, I know that probably opened a lot more cans, so if any of that was confusing or whatever, don't worry. Like that's now what we'll unpack textually for the next several weeks, and so I hope it doesn't remain at the level of just me asserting it, but we'll talk about it through the text. Okay, Father in heaven, thanks for this day and for this time together. Thanks for this chance to learn and study together. We love you, Lord. We trust you. We pray that this upcoming time of worship be glorifying to you and edifying to us. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.